My husband asked for time to strengthen our marriage. The next day, I saw a photo of him with another woman. I'm Brittany, 29 years old, and I used to think I had everything under control. 2 years ago, I married the man I thought was my soulmate, moved into the apartment I bought with my grandmother's inheritance, and felt like I was living the American dream. My grandmother always told me to invest in myself first, and that 2-bedroom apartment in downtown Denver became my sanctuary. I spent months decorating it exactly how I wanted: soft gray walls, plants everywhere, and a reading nook by the window where I could relax after long shifts at the hospital. Working as a specialized nurse in the cardiac unit wasn't just a job for me, it was my calling. The 12-hour shifts were exhausting, but seeing patients recover and go home to their families made every sleepless night worth it. My salary was decent, about $75,000 a year, enough to cover my mortgage and still have money left over for the small luxuries I appreciated: fresh flowers every week, good wine, books I wanted to read, and the occasional spa day when the stress of saving lives became too much. When I met Robert at a cafe near the hospital 3 years ago, he seemed perfect. He was 27, worked as an IT technician for a mid-sized company downtown, and had this quiet confidence that attracted me. He wasn't flashy or overly charming, just stable and reliable. The kind of man who would remember my coffee order, who would listen when I talked about difficult cases at work, who would massage my shoulders after particularly brutal shifts without being asked. We split expenses based on our income. I paid about 60% since I earned more, and he covered 40%. It seemed fair and mature, the kind of arrangement that spoke of partnership instead of traditional gender roles. Robert made about $50,000 a year, which wasn't bad for Denver, but combined with my income, we were comfortable. We could afford good dinners out, weekend trips to the mountains, and the occasional special purchase for the apartment. Our first 18 months of marriage were what I would call wonderfully ordinary. We had our little routines that made life feel stable and predictable in the best possible way. Sunday morning pancakes that Robert made while I read the newspaper. Netflix nights on the couch where we watched entire seasons of shows we'd both gotten invested in. Saturday shopping together, where we debated the merits of different pasta sauces and whether we really needed the expensive ice cream. Robert fixed any technical problems I had, and as someone who barely understood how to update software, I had many. I bandaged him up whenever he hurt himself working on his motorcycle, which was more frequent than either of us would like to admit. We were building something solid, or so I thought. Of course, we had the usual newlywed adjustments. He left dishes in the sink longer than I liked, and I probably nagged him about leaving his tools scattered around the living room. But these seemed like normal growing pains, the kind every couple works through as they learn to share space and make compromises about daily habits. I remember feeling genuinely content during those first months, in a way I'd never experienced before. When my colleagues at the hospital complained about their husbands, those who didn't help with household chores, who didn't understand their jobs, who made them feel guilty for working long hours, I silently counted my blessings. Robert supported my career, never complained about my unpredictable schedule, and seemed genuinely proud when I told him about saving someone's life or helping a family through a crisis. Looking back now, I can see that our foundation was stronger than I realized at the time. We communicated well, respected each other's individual space and interests, and had similar goals for the future. We talked about maybe buying a house in a few years, possibly starting a family when we felt more financially secure. Nothing seemed rushed or forced, but foundations, no matter how solid, can crack when the right pressure is applied in exactly the wrong place. And that pressure came in the form of a man named Derek, someone who would destroy my marriage without ever intending to attack it specifically. He was just living his truth, and unfortunately, his truth was poison to committed relationships. The first sign of trouble came when Robert reconnected with Derek, a colleague from his previous job who had recently gone through what he enthusiastically called a liberating divorce. I knew Derek superficially. He was at our wedding, seemed nice enough, told funny stories about his old workplace, and had brought a decent wedding gift. What I didn't know was how drastically his circumstances had changed in the month since our wedding, or how evangelical he had become about his newly discovered freedom. Derek's ex-wife had been the higher earner in their relationship. She was some kind of marketing executive who made 6 figures, and when she cheated on him and left him, the divorce settlement had been surprisingly generous to Derek. Apparently, her guilt over the infidelity and her desire for a quick, quiet divorce had worked in his favor. Now he was receiving almost $3,000 a month in alimony without working, living in an elegant downtown loft with floor-to-ceiling windows and granite countertops, and spending his days at the gym or exploring Denver's nightlife scene. From the outside, Derek's life seemed like every young man's fantasy. Financial freedom, no responsibilities, and a different beautiful woman on his arm every week. He constantly posted on social media about expensive dinners at restaurants I'd only read about in magazines, weekend trips to Aspen where he skied and partied with people who looked like they'd stepped out of a luxury car commercial, exclusive parties at rooftop bars, and the general theme of living your best life. It was exactly the kind of lifestyle that looked glamorous on Instagram, but struck me as empty and exhausting in reality. The change in Robert after they started hanging out again was subtle at first. He would come home from their outings with this distant look in his eyes, as if he was comparing our quiet evenings to whatever adventure Derek had planned next. He browsed through Derek's social media posts with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, part envy, part curiosity, part something that looked dangerously like longing. Our comfortable routines, the Sunday pancakes, the shopping, the quiet evenings reading together, suddenly seemed to bore him in a way they never had before. My best friend Patricia saw the red flags before I did. We'd been friends since nursing school, and she had a sixth sense about people that had saved me from more than one bad relationship in the past. "That guy gives me the creeps," she said after meeting Derek at a barbecue we hosted. He kept making comments about marriage being a trap and asking Robert if he missed freedom. Who does that at a married couple's house? Initially, I ignored her concerns. Robert was an adult, and I trusted him to choose his friends wisely. Besides, Derek seemed harmless enough. Just a guy enjoying his single life and maybe being a bit too enthusiastic about sharing his perspective. But Patricia's words stuck with me, especially when I started noticing how Derek monopolized Robert's attention whenever we were all together, steering conversations toward topics like living authentically and not settling for mediocrity, and making sure you don't wake up at 40 wondering what you missed. The seed of doubt that Derek planted began to sprout in ways I couldn't have predicted. Suddenly, our comfortable routines weren't enough for Robert. Our quiet evenings became boring. My work schedule became an inconvenience instead of something he'd always supported. The life we'd built together, the life he'd seemed genuinely happy with just months before, began to feel like a cage to him. He started using phrases that sounded exactly like things Derek would say, talking about missing opportunities and settling too early, and exploring everything life has to offer before it's too late. I should have seen the storm coming, but I was too busy being grateful for what we had to notice the clouds gathering on the horizon. I thought our love was strong enough to weather whatever quarter-life crisis Robert was experiencing. I thought the stability and happiness we'd built together would eventually win out over Derek's flashy but fundamentally empty lifestyle. The change in Robert's behavior became impossible to ignore during our second winter of marriage. What started as occasional comments about wanting more excitement in our lives escalated to full arguments about things that had never been problems before. He began questioning why I worked so many extra shifts, interpreting my dedication to my patients as neglect of our relationship in a way that felt unfair and completely out of character for the supportive man I'd married. "You care more about those people at the hospital than you do about me," he said one evening when I came home exhausted from a particularly difficult day. We'd lost a patient, a 42-year-old father of 3 who'd had a massive heart attack during what should have been routine surgery. I was emotionally drained and just wanted Robert's comfort, but instead I received his resentment. "That's not fair, and you know it," I replied, too tired to fight but too hurt to let it pass. "These aren't just random people, Robert. They're human beings fighting for their lives. That man today had 3 children who were counting on him to come home. What about us? What about our life together? When was the last time we went out to dinner? When was the last time we did something spontaneous and fun instead of just sitting in this apartment like we're 60 years old?" The accusations felt like physical blows because there was enough truth in them to hurt. I had been working extra shifts lately. The cardiac unit was chronically understaffed, and I felt a professional and moral obligation to help when colleagues called in sick or when we had particularly challenging cases. But Robert used to understand this about me. He used to be proud of my dedication, not resentful of it. Derek's influence was becoming more obvious with each passing week. Robert started using phrases that sounded exactly like things Derek would say. "We're young. We should be having fun instead of acting like we're retired. Marriage shouldn't feel like work all the time. Maybe we got comfortable too quickly." The most painful part was watching the man I'd married slowly disappear, replaced by this restless stranger who seemed to resent everything we'd built together. The worst part was how he began treating our home differently. The apartment I'd lovingly decorated, the space that had been our sanctuary, suddenly felt inadequate to him. He complained that it was too small, too domestic, too much like playing house. He started staying out later with Derek, coming home with stories about the places they'd been, upscale bars where cocktails cost $20 each, exclusive clubs with velvet ropes and beautiful people, restaurants where appetizers cost more than our usual dinner budget. "You should see this place Derek took me to last night," he'd say, describing some rooftop bar with panoramic city views. The energy was incredible. Everyone was so alive, so present. It made me realize how much we've been sleepwalking through life. I tried to be understanding. Marriage was an adjustment for both of us. And maybe I really had been working too much lately. Maybe we had fallen into routines that felt suffocating instead of comforting. I suggested we plan a weekend getaway. Maybe take that trip to Santa Fe we'd talked about during our engagement. I offered to cut back on my extra shifts, arrange more time for spontaneous adventures. But Robert dismissed my attempts at compromise, saying we needed to address the fundamental issues in our relationship first. "What fundamental issues?" I asked, genuinely confused. "I thought we were happy. I thought we were building something good together." "That's the problem, Brittany. You're content to just exist in this little bubble we've created, but I feel like I'm suffocating. I look at Derek's life and wonder what we're missing. We got married so young, settled down so quickly. What if this really isn't who we are? What if we're just going through the motions because it's what we're supposed to do?" His words felt like ice water in my veins. This man who had proposed to me with tears in his eyes, who had talked about growing old together and building a family, was now questioning whether our entire relationship was just a mistake. The conversations became circular and exhausting. Robert would come home from a night out with Derek full of restless energy and existential questions about our life together. He'd criticize our routines, our goals, our apparent lack of adventure. When I tried to address his concerns or suggest solutions, he'd accuse me of not understanding the deeper issues he was wrestling with. When I asked him to explain these deeper issues, he'd get frustrated and say I was being deliberately obtuse. "It's not about specific things, Brittany. It's about the overall feeling. Don't you ever wonder if we're missing something? Don't you ever want to just throw caution to the wind and see what happens?" "Actually, no," I'd respond honestly. "I like our life. I like the stability we've built. I like coming home to you at the end of a hard day and feeling safe and loved. But what about excitement? What about passion? What about feeling truly alive?" These conversations always ended with him storming out to meet Derek at whatever trendy establishment they'd chosen for the evening, leaving me alone in our apartment wondering when contentment had become the enemy of love. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday night in March. I'd just finished a brutal 14-hour shift dealing with 3 emergency cases, including a 19-year-old college student who'd overdosed and nearly died before we could stabilize her. I was emotionally and physically exhausted, looking forward to nothing more than a hot bath and falling asleep in Robert's arms. Instead, I found him sitting at our kitchen table with a look I'd never seen before, cold and distant, as if he was preparing for a business meeting instead of talking to his wife. "Brittany, we need to talk," he said, gesturing for me to sit across from him. The formality in his voice made my stomach drop. This wasn't the casual, "how was your day" conversation of a married couple. This was something entirely different. "What's wrong? You look like someone died." "Nothing's wrong exactly, it's just that I've been thinking a lot about us, about our marriage, and I think we need to take a step back." I stared at him, not understanding. "A step back from what?" "From each other. From this." He gestured around our apartment, at the life we'd built together. "I think we got serious too quickly, and now we're stuck in this routine that isn't healthy for either of us." The words felt surreal, as if I was watching someone else's life fall apart. "What are you saying, Robert?" "I'm saying I think we need some time apart. Not a separation exactly, just a break. 3 weeks where we can remember who we are as individuals, so we can come back together stronger." The clinical way he presented it, as if it were a reasonable solution to a problem I didn't even know we had, made my blood freeze. This wasn't Robert talking. This was Derek's philosophy dressed up in relationship therapy language. "You want time off from our marriage," I said slowly, making sure I understood correctly. "I want us to have time to miss each other, to remember why we fell in love in the first place. We've gotten so caught up in bills and routines and responsibilities that we've forgotten how to be spontaneous, how to appreciate what we have." The irony was stunning. He wanted to appreciate what we had by temporarily throwing it away. I could have begged. I could have cried and pleaded and promised to change everything about myself to make him happy. 6 months earlier, I probably would have done that. But something about the calculated nature of his request, the way he'd clearly rehearsed this speech, triggered a completely different response. "Okay," I said simply. He blinked, clearly taken aback by my calm acceptance. "Okay? If that's what you need, then okay. 3 weeks. You're not going to fight me on this? I stood up, suddenly feeling clearer than I'd been in months. Robert, if you need time to figure out whether you want to be married to me, then you should have that time. But I need you to understand something. If you walk out that door, if you choose to prioritize whatever Derek has been filling your head with instead of what we've built together, there might not be a way back. He looked uncomfortable for the first time since this conversation began. It's not about Derek, it's about us. No, it's about you, and whatever fantasy life you think you're missing. We spent the next hour working out the logistics with the emotional distance of divorce lawyers. He would stay at his cousin Mike's apartment across town. We wouldn't contact each other except for genuine emergencies. He would take what he needed for 3 weeks and leave the rest. No checking in on how we were doing. No casual texts. No updates on how we were feeling. A complete break, just as he'd asked for. As I watched him pack, throwing clothes haphazardly into a suitcase as if he couldn't wait to escape, I felt something shift inside me. The panic I expected never came. Instead, there was a strange sense of relief, as if I'd been holding my breath for months and could finally exhale. Maybe this break would show him what he was giving up. Or maybe it would show me something I needed to see about the man I'd married. Either way, 3 weeks suddenly didn't seem like nearly enough time for all the things I was beginning to realize I needed to figure out about my own life. The first morning after Robert left was unlike anything I'd experienced in 2 years. I woke up naturally instead of to his alarm, which always went off at 6:30 and played some aggressive rock music that made me feel like I was being attacked by sound. I made coffee in my favorite mug instead of using whatever cup was clean and convenient. I ate breakfast in complete silence while reading the news on my tablet, something Robert always complained about because he preferred morning television to depressing news stories. For the first time in months, I wasn't walking on eggshells, wondering what mood he'd be in or what criticism he'd have about my plans for the day. I didn't have to justify why I wanted to spend Saturday reading instead of being productive. I didn't have to defend my choice to work extra shifts or explain why I cared so much about my patients' well-being. I expected to feel lonely, maybe even devastated. I'd prepared myself for tears, for the overwhelming urge to call him and beg him to come home. Instead, I felt like I could breathe again. The apartment seemed bigger somehow. More like the sanctuary I'd created before Robert moved in with his opinions about furniture placement and his tendency to leave his belongings scattered across every surface. I rearranged the living room back to how I'd originally had it, with the couch facing the windows instead of the TV. I put fresh flowers on the dining table and played music without worrying about whether someone else would complain about my taste in folk singers and indie bands. Each small change felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd forgotten existed. I hung artwork that Robert had criticized as too feminine for a shared space. I lit the vanilla candles he said gave him headaches. I made an elaborate breakfast with ingredients he didn't like: smoked salmon, capers, whole grain bagels with cream cheese, and ate slowly while jazz played in the background. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in over a year. I took a long, hot bath, lit candles around the bathroom, and relaxed with a glass of wine and a book I'd been wanting to read. No one interrupted me to ask what we were having for dinner or to complain about something trivial that had happened at work. The silence wasn't empty. It was peaceful. By the third day, I was rediscovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. I started painting again, something I'd abandoned when Robert complained about the smell of acrylic paint in the apartment. I set up my easel by the window and spent hours working on a landscape I'd sketched during our last trip to the mountains. I called my sister in Portland and we talked for 2 hours without checking the time or worrying about someone else waiting for my attention. I reorganized my closet and found clothes I'd stopped wearing because Robert had made indirect comments about them being too young or impractical or not really your style anymore. I tried on dresses I'd forgotten I owned, jewelry that had been buried in the back of my drawer, shoes that made me feel confident and beautiful. The only contact I had from Robert was a single text on the second day. "Hope you're doing well. I miss you already. This is harder than I thought it would be." I looked at the message for several minutes, noticing how even his attempt at vulnerability felt calculated. If he was really missing me, he wouldn't have needed this break in the first place. I deleted the message without responding. Patricia came by on Friday night with food from our favorite Thai restaurant and a bottle of wine. "You look different," she said, studying my face as we sat cross-legged on my living room floor with containers of pad thai between us. "Different how?" "Relaxed. Like you've been sleeping better or something. And there's something in your eyes I haven't seen in months. You look like yourself again." I realized she was right. The constant low-level tension I'd been carrying for months had melted away. I wasn't second-guessing every decision or bracing myself for criticism. I wasn't moderating my personality to avoid conflict or walking on eggshells around someone else's moods. I was just existing peacefully in my own space, being myself without apology. Maybe I have been sleeping better, I admitted. It's been nice having the place to myself. Quiet. Patricia raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment directly. She'd never liked Robert, though she'd been diplomatic enough not to say much about it until recently. Now, with him gone, she seemed to be choosing her words carefully, but I could see the relief in her expression. Heard from him? One text. I didn't respond. Good for you. Let him wonder what you're doing. But I wasn't playing games or trying to make him wonder about anything. I was genuinely enjoying my solitude in a way that surprised me. The marriage I'd fought so hard to preserve suddenly seemed less appealing than the peace I'd found without it. On Saturday morning, the second day of our break, I was scrolling through Facebook while having my coffee when I saw something that changed everything. The Neon Lounge, a trendy downtown bar I'd never visited but had heard about from younger colleagues, had posted photos from their ladies' night event the night before. I almost scrolled past it. I had no interest in nightclub photos or the party scene that seemed so important to Derek's world, but something in one of the background photos caught my eye. There, in the corner of a group shot taken near the bar, was Robert. He was leaning against the wall with his arm around a blonde woman I didn't recognize. They weren't just casually together. His hand was resting possessively on her waist, and she was pressed against his side as if they'd been together for months, not hours. Both were laughing at something, completely oblivious to the photographer capturing their intimate moment. I stared at the photo for several long minutes, zooming in to make sure I wasn't mistaken. There was no doubt it was Robert, and there was no doubt about the nature of his interaction with this woman. The body language was unmistakable. This wasn't casual conversation with a stranger Derek had introduced him to. This was intimacy, attraction, the kind of chemistry that doesn't develop over a few hours of polite conversation. The timestamp on the photo confirmed it was taken Thursday night, less than 24 hours after he'd left our apartment claiming he needed time to strengthen our marriage. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, but it was quickly followed by something entirely different, a cold, crystalline clarity I'd never experienced before. This wasn't about needing space or time to appreciate what we had. This was about Robert wanting permission to cheat without technically being a cheater, to explore his options while keeping me as a backup plan. He'd manipulated me into agreeing to this break so he could pursue someone else without guilt, then had the audacity to text me about missing me while apparently not missing me at all. The break wasn't about strengthening our marriage. It was about giving him legal and emotional cover to do exactly what he'd wanted to do all along. I screenshotted the photo and saved it to my phone, though I wasn't sure why yet. Some instinct told me I might need evidence of this moment later. Then I did something that surprised me. I started laughing. Not the bitter, hysterical laughter of someone having a breakdown, but genuine amusement at the sheer audacity of what Robert had done. He'd asked for 3 weeks to remember why he loved me. Instead, he'd shown me exactly who he really was in less than 3 days. The pain I expected to feel was there, sharp and deep, but it was overshadowed by something much more powerful: anger. Not the hot, explosive kind that makes you do stupid things, but the cold, calculating kind that makes you very, very careful about your next moves. I picked up my coffee and opened my laptop. I had some research to do, and suddenly, 3 weeks seemed like the perfect amount of time to plan my response to this situation. Robert wanted to play games? Fine. But he was about to learn that some games have consequences he never saw coming. I spent the rest of Saturday in what I can only describe as a state of surgical calm. The same focused mindset that helped me save lives in the cardiac unit was now being applied to systematically dismantling the life Robert thought he could return to whenever he got bored with his newfound freedom. My first call was to a locksmith. "I need to change all the locks on my apartment today," I told him. "It's an emergency situation." "Domestic dispute?" he asked, probably having dealt with similar requests before. Something like that. While I waited for him to arrive, I began the methodical process of packing Robert's belongings. Every shirt, every pair of shoes, every book and gadget and piece of memorabilia went into boxes I'd gotten from the recycling center in our building's basement. I wasn't angry as I packed. I was efficient, clinical. Each item I folded and placed in a box was evidence of a life he'd chosen to abandon. I found myself handling his belongings with the same care I'd use for medical equipment. Precise, thorough, but emotionally detached. His favorite sweater, the one I'd given him for Christmas last year, the motorcycle magazines he loved reading in bed on Sunday mornings, the framed photo of us from our honeymoon in Sedona, both sunburned and smiling on a red rock formation. Everything went into boxes with the same methodical precision. I packed his cologne, his electric razor, his collection of graphic novels, his gaming headset, his protein powder, his work clothes, his casual clothes, his one good suit, his running shoes, his hiking boots. Every item that marked his presence in our shared space was carefully removed and boxed. As I worked, I realized how much of my apartment had been taken over by his things, how much space I'd given up without even noticing. The locksmith arrived at noon and had new locks installed within 2 hours. I kept one key and gave the spare to Patricia, who had insisted on coming to help despite my protests that I was fine. "You're scaring me a little," she said, watching me pack Robert's things with machine-like precision. "This is very composed for someone whose husband is cheating." "I'm not composed," I corrected, carefully folding another shirt. "I'm focused. There's a difference." "What are you going to do with all this stuff?" "Pack everything up and have it delivered to where he's staying. He wanted his freedom. He can have all of it." Next, I called our credit card companies. Robert was an authorized user on 2 of my cards, mainly for convenience when we were shopping together, or when he needed to make purchases for household expenses. The cards had a combined limit of about $15,000, which he'd never come close to maxing out, but they were in my name and I was responsible for any charges. "I need to remove an authorized user from my accounts," I told each customer service representative. "We're getting divorced." "I'm sorry to hear that," they'd respond sympathetically. "We can issue you new cards within 3 business days." I canceled those cards and issued new ones. Then I removed him from our shared Netflix account, our family Spotify plan, and the Amazon Prime account he used regularly for everything from protein bars to motorcycle parts. I changed the passwords to our streaming services and our home Wi-Fi network. Every digital connection between us was severed with the same methodical precision I'd used to pack his physical belongings. The most satisfying part was changing the Netflix password. Robert was in the middle of a series he'd been binge-watching, some action show I had no interest in. The thought of him trying to log in from Mike's apartment and finding himself locked out made me smile for the first time all day. I printed out the Facebook photo and put it in an envelope along with a simple note. "Saw this from the Neon Lounge Thursday night. Thought you should know I found out about your break activities. Your things are in the lobby with the doorman. The keys don't work anymore. Don't contact me again." By Sunday evening, 17 boxes of Robert's belongings were neatly stacked in our building's package room, labeled with his name and his cousin Mike's address. The doorman, Marcus, was a sweet older man in his 60s who'd watched me grow into marriage and was now watching me systematically erase it. "You sure about this, Miss Brittany?" he asked, though his tone suggested he approved of my decision. "This seems pretty final. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." I left the envelope with his things and went back upstairs to my apartment. My apartment, not ours, and ordered Chinese food from the place Robert never liked because he said the portions were too small and the vegetables too healthy. For the first time in days, I felt genuine hunger. I sat at my dining table, eating lumen and looking around the space that was entirely mine again, and felt something I hadn't expected: relief. Monday morning brought Robert's first wave of panic. My phone started buzzing at 7 a.m. with calls I didn't answer. Then came the text messages, each more desperate than the last. "Brittany, what's going on? Why aren't my keys working? Can you call me, please? I need to explain. This is crazy. We're supposed to be working on our marriage. Please don't do this. It was just one night. It didn't mean anything. I know how this looks, but you're not understanding the situation. Derek introduced me to some people. I was just being social. Nothing happened. You're overreacting. Can we talk about this like adults? I'm coming over there. We need to work this out." I read each message with detached interest, as if I was observing someone else's domestic drama. The man who wanted space to strengthen our marriage was now frantically trying to maintain contact, apparently having realized that actions have consequences. When he showed up at the hospital where I worked on Tuesday afternoon, Patricia intercepted him in the lobby. She found me during my break and reported his desperate attempts to reach me. He's claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that the woman in the photo was just some random person Derek introduced him to, that nothing happened between them. He looks terrible, by the way, like he hasn't slept since Sunday. "Did you tell him I saw the photo?" "I told him you saw everything and that he needs to stay away from you. I also mentioned that we have security here and they don't like men showing up to harass staff members. He looked like he was going to be sick." Good. The calls and messages continued for 3 days. Robert alternated between desperate apologies, angry accusations, and attempts to negotiate. He claimed Derek had pressured him into going out, that he'd had too much to drink, that he'd never intended for anything to happen. The woman in the photo, he swore, was just someone he'd talked to for a few minutes at the bar. But I'd done my research. The Neon Lounge had multiple photos from that night posted on their social media accounts. In several of them, Robert and the blonde woman, who I discovered through some internet detective work was named Madison and worked as a bartender at another downtown club called Velvet, were clearly together, clearly comfortable with each other, clearly not strangers who had just met. In one photo, they were dancing, her arms around his neck while his hands rested on her hips. In another, she was leaning into him while he whispered something in her ear, both laughing as if they were sharing private jokes. In a third, taken later in the evening, they were leaving the club together, his hand on her back in a gesture so intimate and possessive it made my stomach turn. These weren't the interactions of two people who had just been introduced. This was the body language of attraction, of chemistry, of two people who were very interested in each other. On Thursday, exactly 1 week after he'd left for his break, Robert showed up at my apartment building. Marcus called to let me know, and I told him to let Robert come up. It was time to end this charade. When I opened the door, Robert looked haggard. His hair was greasy, his clothes wrinkled, and he had the desperate look of someone who had finally realized the magnitude of what he'd lost. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he'd clearly been surviving on coffee and anxiety for the past few days. "Brittany, please, just give me 5 minutes to explain." I stepped aside and let him into the apartment he no longer had keys to. He looked around as if seeing it for the first time, taking in the changes I'd made, the absence of his belongings, the finality of what I'd done. The apartment looked bigger without his clutter, more like the space I'd created before he moved in with his opinions about everything. "You changed everything," he said quietly, his voice hollow. "I put everything back the way it was before you moved in. This is my apartment, Robert. It always was. But we're married. This is our home. You left our home to go play house with someone else. You can't have it both ways." He sank into the chair that used to be his favorite, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered the photo, the lies, the manipulation, and the feeling passed quickly. "It was a mistake," he said. "The biggest mistake of my life. Derek kept saying I was missing opportunities, that I was too young to be tied down, and I let him get in my head. I should never have listened to him. You're right. You should never have listened to him. But more than that, you should never have put our marriage on hold so you could explore your options. That's not what I was doing." I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos from the Neon Lounge. All of them. The dancing, the whispering, the leaving together. "This was taken 12 hours after you walked out that door, Robert. 12 hours. You weren't taking time to miss me or strengthen our marriage. You were auditioning my replacement." The defeated look that crossed his face told me everything I needed to know. Whatever story he'd been telling himself about that night, he knew the truth as well as I did. "How did you find these photos?" "Facebook is public, Robert. And apparently you and Madison weren't as discreet as you thought." He winced at the mention of her name. "You know her name?" "I know a lot of things. I know she works at Velvet. I know she's 24. I know she's not some random person Derek introduced you to. You spent the entire evening with her. Brittany, I swear to you, nothing happened that night. We talked, we danced, but that's it. I was confused and stupid, but I didn't cheat on you. You cheated on me emotionally. You went out looking for connection with another woman less than a day after telling me you needed space from our marriage. The fact that you might not have slept with her that specific night doesn't make it better." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red. "What do I need to do to fix this?" "I'll do anything. I'll cut Derek completely out of my life. I'll go to therapy. I'll prove to you every day that I learned from this. There's nothing you can do, Robert. You made your choice when you decided our marriage wasn't enough for you. You made your choice when you walked out that door to find excitement with someone else. You made your choice when you lied to me about what this break really was. So that's it? 2 years of marriage and you're just done? I'm not the one who threw away 2 years of marriage. You are. I'm just accepting the reality of what you showed me." He sat there for a few more minutes, maybe hoping I'd change my mind, maybe just processing the finality of the situation. Finally, he stood and walked toward the door. "I love you, Brittany. I know I screwed everything up, but I love you. No, Robert. You love the security I provided. You love having someone to come home to when your adventures get lonely, but you don't love me enough to choose me over whatever fantasy Derek sold you about single life." After he left, I poured a glass of wine and sat in my reading nook, looking out at the city lights. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt truly at peace with my decision. Robert had shown me exactly who he was when confronted with commitment and responsibility. And I had shown myself that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. Robert tried everything to change my mind in the weeks that followed. He sent flowers to the hospital with notes begging for forgiveness, elaborate arrangements that must have cost half a week's salary. He showed up at my favorite coffee shop every morning for a week, hoping to accidentally run into me, until I started going to a completely different place. He even got his cousin Mike to call me, claiming Robert was devastated and not eating or sleeping and just needs one more chance to explain everything. When that didn't work, he tried to get mutual friends to intervene. Sarah from his work called to tell me Robert had been a mess at the office, barely functional and constantly talking about how much he regretted everything. Tom and Jessica, a couple we occasionally went out with, invited me to dinner and spent the entire evening trying to convince me that everyone makes mistakes, and Robert deserved forgiveness. "He learned his lesson," Jessica insisted over dessert. "You should see how devastated he is about this. Don't you think the marriage is worth fighting for?" I had contacted a divorce attorney on the Monday after discovering the photo, and papers were already being prepared. Colorado was a no-fault divorce state, which meant his infidelity wouldn't impact the financial aspects of the divorce, but it had certainly clarified my emotional position. I didn't want anything from him except my maiden name back and the complete removal of his presence from my life. The irony wasn't lost on me that Robert's supposed search for freedom had led him to become increasingly desperate to return to the stability he'd thrown away. Meanwhile, I was discovering a version of myself I'd forgotten existed. Independent, decisive, and surprisingly content with my own company. I'd started pottery classes on Thursday nights, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for when I was managing someone else's emotional needs alongside my demanding career. I reconnected with college friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage, women who reminded me of who I was before I started moderating my personality to keep Robert comfortable. My performance at work actually improved during this period. Without the constant stress of managing a slowly dying relationship, I found myself more focused, more present with my patients, more able to give my full attention to the life and death decisions that were part of my daily routine. Then, about 6 weeks after our separation, Patricia called me with news that changed everything. "You're not going to believe this," she said, barely containing her excitement. "Remember Madison, the bartender from the photo? Unfortunately, she's pregnant." I almost dropped my phone. "What?" "My cousin Jen works at the downtown clinic, and she saw Madison getting a pregnancy test last week. Apparently she's been seeing some married guy, and now she's freaking out because she's definitely pregnant, and he's been trying to get back with his wife." The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Robert's desperate attempts to reconcile with me weren't just about realizing what he'd lost. They were about avoiding the consequences of what he'd done. "How far along is she?" I asked, though I had a feeling I already knew the answer. "Jen thinks about 8 weeks, which would put conception right around the time of that photo." 8 weeks. Right around the time Robert was telling me he needed space to strengthen our marriage. I hung up with Patricia and sat in my quiet apartment, processing this information. Part of me felt vindicated. Robert's betrayal was even worse than I'd imagined, but another part of me felt genuine pity for Madison. She was only 24, working as a bartender at a nightclub, and now facing an unplanned pregnancy with a man who had lied to her about his availability and was desperately trying to abandon her for his wife. The next few days brought a series of developments that would have been comical if they weren't so pathetic. Robert's calls became even more frantic, though he never mentioned Madison or the pregnancy. He was clearly hoping to reconcile with me before I found out about his growing list of problems. Through Patricia's remarkably efficient gossip network, I learned that Madison had confronted Robert about his marital status after discovering he was still legally married and trying to get back with me. Apparently, Robert had told her we were separated and heading for divorce, conveniently leaving out the part where our separation was supposedly temporary and our marriage was supposedly going to be strengthened by the experience. According to the Bartender Gossip Network, Madison had kicked Robert out of her apartment when she realized the extent of his lies. She had allegedly thrown his clothes out her second-story apartment window while screaming at him about being a lying, cheating bastard who couldn't even be honest about what he wanted. The man who wanted freedom from the trap of marriage now found himself facing 18 years of child support payments to a woman who couldn't stand him, while simultaneously losing the wife who had actually loved him. Robert was apparently staying in cheap extended-stay motels, unable to afford a real apartment after Madison kicked him out and with his divorce legal fees piling up. His credit was probably ruined from the cards I'd canceled, and his cousin Mike had made it clear that the couch surfing arrangement was temporary. Derek, his supposed friend and bad influence, had completely distanced himself from the situation once it became complicated. According to mutual acquaintances, Derek was now claiming he'd never encouraged Robert to cheat, just to live a little and make sure he was happy. He had apparently blocked Robert's number after Robert started calling multiple times a day, panicking about the pregnancy and begging for advice. I learned all of this not from Robert, who was still maintaining the fantasy that we could work things out if I just listened to reason, but from Patricia's increasingly detailed reports from her network of friends and acquaintances. Denver's social scene was smaller than people realized, and news of Robert's spectacular implosion was spreading through the service industry and nightlife community like wildfire. The story had all the elements of good gossip: a cheating husband, a pregnant mistress, a wronged wife who had handled the situation with surgical precision, and a spectacular fall for a man who thought he could have everything without consequences. 3 months after Robert had left seeking adventure and excitement, he had managed to destroy his marriage, alienate the woman he'd cheated with, lose his housing stability, and commit himself to nearly 2 decades of financial obligation to a child he'd never planned with a woman who wanted nothing to do with him except a monthly support check. The final blow came when Madison served him with official paternity papers, legally establishing his responsibility for child support that would begin as soon as the baby was born. The amount, based on his IT technician salary, would be substantial enough to ensure his lifestyle remained decidedly unglamorous for the foreseeable future. I found myself in the strange position of feeling sorry for everyone involved except Robert. Madison was facing single motherhood at 24 with a father who had proven himself unreliable and deceptive. The unborn child would grow up with a father who saw them as a burden instead of a blessing, a constant reminder of the night that destroyed his comfortable life. Even Derek, in his own way, had lost a friend and gained a reputation as someone who gave terrible advice and abandoned people when they needed support. But Robert? Robert had made his choices with full knowledge of the potential consequences. He had chosen to prioritize temporary excitement over lasting commitment. He had chosen to lie to both me and Madison about his intentions. He had chosen to risk everything for a few weeks of feeling young and free. Now he was discovering that freedom came with a price he couldn't afford, and responsibilities that would follow him for the next 2 decades. The knock on my door came on a Sunday evening in late November, almost 9 months after Robert had first asked for his break. I was curled up on my couch reading a novel, something I could do regularly again without interruption, when I heard the familiar rhythm of his knock. I considered ignoring it, but something about the hesitant, almost timid quality of the sound made me curious. When I opened the door, I barely recognized the man standing in my hallway. Robert had lost at least 20 pounds and looked like he hadn't slept properly in weeks. His clothes were clean but clearly old and worn, the kind of cheap basics you buy at discount stores when you're watching every dollar. He had the hollow-eyed look of someone who had been living on stress and regret for months. "Hi, Brittany," he said quietly. "I know you probably don't want to see me, but I was hoping we could talk, just for a few minutes." Against my better judgment, I let him in. He stood awkwardly in the middle of my living room, looking around the space that had once been his home and was now clearly, definitively mine. I had redecorated over the summer. New curtains, some different furniture, artwork that reflected only my taste. It looked nothing like the place he'd left. "You look good," he said. "Happy." I was happy. The past months of single life had reminded me who I was when I wasn't constantly managing someone else's emotions and expectations. I had started considering going back to school for a nurse practitioner degree. I had gone on a few dates, nothing serious yet, but enough to remind me that I was an interesting and attractive woman who deserved to be treated well. "Thank you. What did you want to talk about?" Robert sank into the chair I offered and put his head in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red and desperate. "I ruined everything," he said simply. "Everything good in my life? I destroyed it all because I was stupid and selfish and listened to the wrong person. Derek? Derek disappeared the minute things got complicated. Turns out he's not interested in friendship when it comes with consequences. I haven't heard from him since Madison served me with the paternity papers." I wasn't surprised. Derek had always struck me as the type of person who encouraged chaos in other people's lives while maintaining careful distance from any fallout. "The baby's due in March," Robert continued. "Madison and we tried to make it work for a while, but she can't stand me. She says I lied to her about being separated, and she's right. I told her we were getting divorced when we were really just taking a break. I told her you and I were over when I was planning to come back to you. You lied to her. I lied to everyone. I lied to you about needing space when what I really wanted was permission to cheat. I lied to Madison about my marriage being over. I lied to myself about what I was doing and why I was doing it. The honesty was refreshing, if several months too late. I'm going to be paying child support for the next 18 years to someone who won't even let me see the kid unless we go through lawyers. I'm living in a studio apartment that costs more than my old share of our mortgage, and I can barely afford groceries after my support payments. But none of that matters compared to losing you. He looked at me with desperation so raw I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I threw away the best thing in my life for a few weeks of pretending to be someone I'm not. But if there's any chance, any possibility that we could try again? No, I said quietly but firmly. Brittany, please. I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy. I'll cut Derek completely out of my life. I'll prove to you every day that I learned from this. Robert, do you remember what you said to me when you asked for this break? He looked confused by the question. You said you wanted 3 weeks to remember why you loved me, to appreciate what we had. Do you remember that? Yes. You got your 3 weeks. You got time to experience life without me, to see what else was out there, to explore your options. And in that time, you chose someone else. You chose to risk our marriage for a stranger in a bar. You chose excitement over stability, fantasy over reality. I made a mistake. No, Robert. You made a choice. Multiple choices. You chose to listen to Derek instead of your wife. You chose to put our marriage on hold. You chose to go out looking for something better. You chose to lie to both me and Madison about what you wanted. Those weren't mistakes, they were decisions. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. You know what I learned during our break? I learned that I'm happier without you than I was with you. I learned that I don't need someone who sees our life together as something to escape from. I learned that I deserve better than a man who thinks the grass is always greener somewhere else. But I know better now. I know what I lost. You know what you lost because you lost it. But that doesn't mean you've changed. It just means you're experiencing consequences. I turned back to face him. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave here tonight and you're going to build a life as a single father. You're going to pay your child support faithfully and try to be the best father you can to that child. You're going to learn to live with the choices you made. What about us? There is no us, Robert. There hasn't been since the moment you decided our marriage wasn't enough for you. He sat there for a few more minutes, maybe hoping I'd change my mind, maybe just processing the finality of the situation. Finally, he stood and walked toward the door. I really did love you, Brittany. I know you did, but you loved the idea of freedom more. After he left, I made a cup of tea and settled back on my couch with my book. My divorce had been finalized 2 months earlier, and I was officially Brittany again, the name I was born with, the name that belonged only to me. 6 months later, I ran into Derek at a downtown coffee shop. He was with a woman who looked remarkably like Madison. Young, blonde, pretty. When he saw me, he had the decency to look embarrassed. Brittany, he said, how are you? I'm doing very well, thank you. I heard about you and Robert. I'm sorry it didn't work out. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had helped destroy my marriage without ever understanding the impact of his influence. Are you really? Or are you just sorry you got blamed for giving terrible advice? He had no answer for that. As for Robert, I heard through mutual friends that he was struggling but surviving. He had moved to a cheaper apartment closer to Madison so he could see his daughter, a little girl they named Emma, on the weekends Madison allowed. He was working overtime to pay child support and living expenses, but apparently was trying to be a good father despite the circumstances. Madison had finished her business administration degree and gotten a job at a marketing firm. She was dating someone new, a guy who knew about Emma and was apparently good with kids. From what I heard, she was building a stable life for herself and her daughter, with Robert's financial support, but minimal emotional involvement. And me? I was thriving. I had started the nurse practitioner program and was loving the challenge of expanding my medical knowledge. I bought a small house with a garden where I could grow herbs and vegetables. I was dating a pediatric surgeon named David who made me laugh and supported my career ambitions, and never once made me feel like I needed to be anyone different from exactly who I was. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not giving Robert another chance, if I think I was too harsh or unforgiving. The answer is always no. Robert showed me who he was when confronted with commitment and responsibility, and I believed him. He taught me that some people will always wonder if there's something better waiting for them somewhere else. But he also taught me something valuable about myself, that I'm strong enough to walk away from anything that doesn't serve me, even when it's hard, even when it means starting over, even when everyone expects you to forgive and forget, because that's what good wives are supposed to do. Robert wanted his freedom, and eventually he got it. But freedom always comes with a price. and some prices are higher than others. His cost him everything he'd claimed to value, including the wife who would have loved him through anything, if only he'd been brave enough to choose love over fantasy. As for me, I learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well, being happy, and never looking back. I learned that being alone is infinitely better than being with someone who makes you feel alone. And I learned that when someone shows you who they really are, you should believe them the first time. Robert had asked for 3 weeks to decide if he wanted me. In the end, 3 days were enough for me to decide I didn't want him anymore. And that was the best decision I ever made. Today, 2 years after all of this, I have a life that is truly mine. David and I are engaged. He proposed in the garden of our new house, surrounded by the herbs I planted and the sunflowers that grow wild along the back fence. I completed my nurse practitioner program and now work in the cardiac transplant unit, saving lives in ways I never imagined possible. Robert still pays child support for Emma, who is now 2 years old and apparently a beautiful, bright child. Madison married her boyfriend, and they had another child together. From what I hear, Robert sees Emma every other weekend and is trying to be a present father, though the circumstances aren't ideal. Derek, I heard, continues giving bad advice to married men and disappearing when consequences arrive. Some people never learn. But I learned. I learned that true love doesn't make you question your worth or moderate your personality. I learned that the right person will never make you feel like an obstacle to their happiness. I learned that stability and contentment aren't synonymous with boredom. They're synonymous with safety, with trust, with peace. Robert taught me a valuable lesson, though not the one he intended. He taught me that I deserve someone who chooses me every day, not someone who needs to explore other options to appreciate what they have. He taught me that sometimes the greatest act of self-love is having the courage to say no. No to undeserved second chances, no to empty promises, no to people who see our love as something guaranteed. And in the end, Robert gave me the greatest gift of all, the opportunity to discover my own strength, my own resilience, my own ability to create a beautiful and meaningful life entirely on my own terms. Sometimes the best thing that can happen is someone leaving your life so you can discover who you really are without them. And for that, ironically, I'll be eternally grateful to Robert. He wanted his freedom, and in freeing me from him, he gave me mine.